Al-Aqsa flood on the 7th of October 2023 threw the imperialist system into political crisis, delaying or shattering normalization agreements and showing that the Zionist state, the so-called strongest army in the Middle East, is not unbeatable. And today, we've now witnessed over 2 years of genocide, which every imperialist state has been an active participant in. Our ruling class's role, Britain's role, has been particularly disgusting. And just to name a few examples, it has actively participated in the genocide by flying spy plane flights over Gaza to provide intelligence to the Zionist state to carry out bombings and assassinations. It's allowed the Zionist state to use RAF bases to refuel, resupply and maintain F-35 fighter jets that are levelling Gaza. While a relatively small amount, it has sold munitions and F-35 components to the Zionist state. And it has cracked down on Palestine solidarity in Britain, and it has provided political and diplomatic cover to the Zionist state, going so far as to try to gaslight us by denying that a genocide is taking place, despite the fact that it is live streamed for us all to see at the click of a button on our smartphones. That is the role that Britain has played in the last 2 years. And despite being back to the hill by European, British and US imperialism, the Zionist state has achieved nothing in Gaza for 2 years. The might of imperialism has been raining down on this tiny strip of land, and they have been unable to defeat the Palestinian resistance. Israel cannot defeat it militarily, and this is down to the efforts of the steadfast Palestinian people. And now the Zionist state is bogged down in an unwinnable, protracted war and is finding itself isolated on the world stage. The utter barbarity of the Zionist state, shown by massacred children, leveled neighborhoods, starving Palestinians, concentration camps, torture in prisons, has now destroyed the credibilities of not only the Zionist state, but the ruling classes that back them. And the Labour Party in particular, the party in government, has exposed itself for what we at FRFI has always seen it as, a racist, genocidal, pro-imperialist party. So now the ruling classes find themselves in a deepening political crisis. They have no legitimacy, and there are now solidarity movements with Palestine, and they refuse to go away. Palestine has politicized an entire generation of people who have been exposed to the realities of what imperialism is. And that is why, on the 21st of September, the Labour government was forced to recognise a Palestinian state. But we can't be fooled by all of this talk of peace and solutions. This recognition is a cynical attempt for British imperialism to protect its interests in the Middle East. And it serves 3 purposes. Firstly, it's an attempt to isolate the armed resistance from the Palestinian masses. Secondly, it's an attempt for British imperialism to assert its own interests in the Middle East by propping up the pro-Zionist and reactionary Palestinian Authority, which was recently sidelined by US imperialism. And finally, it's a desperate attempt to restore its own ruined credibilities by throwing a fig leaf to moderates within the movement. US President Donald Trump's peace plan, which has now led to ceasefire negotiations, is also an attempt by US imperialism to end the war on its own terms. It will attempt to open up Gaza for imperialist profit-making under the stewardship of war criminal and arch-imperialist Tony Blair. Both Palestinian statehood and the so-called peace plan do nothing to advance Palestinian self-determination. Both are attempts to impose pro-imperialist solutions onto the question of Palestine because the Zionist state has no answer for the unwavering Palestinian resistance. The resistance factions in Palestine are now entering into negotiations with the imperialists, and they have every right to do this as the leaders of their own liberation struggle. But for us, the material facts have not changed. The British ruling class is up to its neck in genocide, and it has been for over 2 years. Britain's support for Zionism remains unconditional because Israel is the key to maintaining imperialist domination across the Middle East. So, a defeat for Zionism would be catastrophic for the ruling class. The solidarity movement in Britain on the whole has not been appeased by this recognition of a Palestinian state, and it continues to take to the streets in solidarity with Palestine. This political situation means that we still have a role to play as communists. We need to understand our tasks in Britain, and in order to do this, we need to understand and look at the communist position on national liberation struggles and look at the Palestine solidarity movement in Britain to understand our tasks. And to do that, we need to understand imperialism and the split in the working class. Because when capitalism entered its imperialist phase at the turn of the 20th century, the world was divided into two camps, broad camps: oppressed nations on one side and oppressed nations on the other side. But imperialism not only divided the world between oppressed and oppressed nations, but the working class in the imperialist heartlands was divided as well. On the one hand, you have the labour aristocracy, a privileged upper layer of the working class, essentially bought off by the super profits that come from the plundering and the exploitation of the rest of the world. And then you have the masses of the working class in the imperialist country, the real majority, who have nothing to gain from imperialism but a world to win from destroying imperialism. By recognizing this fact, we can understand that there can be no movement for socialism in Britain until the masses of the working class, fighting for their own interests, unite with liberation movements in oppressed nations to struggle against their own ruling class and their bought-off agents in the labour movement. As communists, we must try to unite with the liberation movement in Palestine for the purpose of socialist revolution in this country as well. That is what makes Palestine such a key question for communists in an imperialist country. This forms the basis for the communist position on national liberation struggles and the right of nations to self-determination. It was laid out by Marx, Engels, and Lenin, especially in the Third International. In an imperialist nation like Britain, we give our unconditional support to liberation struggles of oppressed nations, and we support all sections of national liberation movements. We don't sit on the sidelines and heckle and lecture what tactics liberation movements adopt, nor do we try to tell them the so-called correct forms of struggle. And at the same time, national movements in oppressed nations can't impose their own forms of struggle on solidarity in imperialist nations. While the working class in Britain and Palestine have the same goal, which is the destruction of imperialism in the Middle East, we necessarily have to approach that goal by different paths. The enemy of the Palestinian people is the Zionist state itself. Our direct enemy is the British ruling class that has backed genocide for 2 years. So, an effective Palestine solidarity movement in Britain has to confront the British state. And in order to achieve this, we need to have a clear understanding of the class forces in Britain, understanding what the makeup of the solidarity movement is. And in order to do that, we need to look at the role of the labour aristocracy and the self-appointed leadership of Palestine solidarity in Britain. This leadership is mainly the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. And the Palestine Solidarity Campaign and their allies have utterly failed to challenge the British state and its support for genocide. Their strategy has remained the same as it has for basically its entire existence: planned marches, lobbying Parliament, appealing to the so-called good side of Labour MPs. They can mobilise, it's true, hundreds of thousands of people that are furious at seeing what is happening in Gaza. But what have they done with the popular anger that we've seen in Britain? Their marches are planned with the police ensuring that they're as non-disruptive as possible. Marches through central London don't even happen that much anymore, despite the fact that when the genocide was in fact intensifying, they continued this strategy. And their demands remain limited to really what is an arms embargo, despite the fact that arms sales are a tiny fraction of the entire makeup of Britain's support for Zionism. And predictably, of course, they maintain their hold on the movement through sectarianism and isolating anyone seen as radical. They refuse to defend anyone facing state repression that is outside of their own clique. So really, if this is what the opposition is in Britain, can we really be surprised that Britain's support for Zionism has not changed throughout the PSC's entire existence? But the PSC are also politically bankrupt. Just look at their relationship to the Palestinian ambassador to Britain, Hassan Zomlot, who is a representative of the reactionary Palestinian Authority, outright Zionist collaborators that imprison Palestinian resistance fighters and assassinate Palestinian resistance leaders. Zomlot speaks at PSC AGMs and platforms, but while Zionist collaborators are celebrated by the PSC, actual Palestinian revolutionaries are censored by the PSC. For example, we brought this up many times in Birmingham when they cancelled a fundraising event that Layla Khalid was meant to speak at. The well-known revolutionary from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Layla Khalid, and they cancelled her. So, the PSC may criticise the British state in its statement, and it has made this criticism about the fact that the British state is making its recognition of a Palestinian state conditional on who governs the Palestinian people. But they say nothing about the Palestinian Authority in that statement. They say nothing about the Palestinian Authority on their platform. And it's the Palestinian Authority that British imperialism wants to impose on the Palestinian people. And it's the Palestinian Authority that the PSC has ties to. So when we take all of this together, it should become really obvious that the PSC does not support the liberation movement in Palestine. Neither do they support the right of the Palestinian people to resist oppression through any means necessary. This is simply chauvinism, classic, outright, pro-imperialist British chauvinism on the question of Palestine. The PSC would either prefer to pretend that the armed struggle in Palestine doesn't exist, and when they do mention it, it's usually because they've been pressed to condemn it, despite the fact that they give empty proclamations supporting that right in theory. This is because the PSC are simply trying to strip the Palestinian struggle of its anti-imperialist content and turn it into a humanitarian issue. This is not the politics that is needed in Britain to fight for Palestinian self-determination. But everything that I have mentioned is not a question of simply bad ideas or mistaken tactics. There is a material basis to it, and it is a product of the class interests that the PSC represents. They represent the interests of the petty bourgeoisie and the Labour aristocracy. Throughout the PSC's existence, Labour Party supporters and the trade unions have funded the PSC. As I said before, the working class is split by imperialism between the mass and the privileged upper layer. And this privileged upper layer has privileges directly tied to the continued viability of imperialism. This privileged upper layer has historically dominated the trade unions, the labour movement, and organisations that claim to represent the working class. It has historically been represented by the Labour Party, but as we've seen, that representation and alliance is now thrown into question. The political standpoint of this layer is essentially to call for imperialism to be reformed, but not destroyed, because that would threaten the basis of its privileges. That is why this layer cannot and has not taken a consistent anti-imperialist position. This explains why trade union statements, virtually everyone immediately after the 7th of October in 2023 condemned both Hamas and the Israeli response to it, as if you can equate an occupier, a genocidal, parasitic, settler entity with the people they are trying to wipe off the face of the planet. Every left MP has done the same, left Labour MP, such as Jeremy Corbyn. None of them actually reject the legitimacy of the Zionist state. They do not reject its legitimacy, which is why they fall back on the consistent safe option of calling for a two-state solution. The Palestine Solidarity Campaign, Stop the War, and all of the rest of that little clique of people that lead Palestine Solidarity in Britain, they are all part of that rotten pro-imperialist tradition. Working class and traitors to oppressed people everywhere. An effective solidarity movement can't be rooted in this layer of the working class in Britain. So, when we know and understand the roots and material basis of opportunism on the question of Palestine, we have to understand our tasks as well as communists. Because the last 2 years have shown that the Zionist state has been able to act with total impunity, in part because of the economic, political, and military support it gets from the British state. While the Palestinian people's main enemy is the Zionist state, our main enemy remains the British ruling class. Whatever the results of these peace negotiations between the resistance and the Zionist state are, our tasks in Britain do not change. We must end all British support for Zionism. That means no more economic support, no more political support, no more military support, and an end to this normalization that allows a parasitic genocidal entity to continue to exist. Concretely, this would mean complete sanctions applied to the Israeli state. But from that, we can draw many other conclusions of what these principles are. For example, we know that we have to defend the right of the Palestinian people to resist their occupiers through any means necessary, up to and including the use of armed struggle. We don't pick or choose what section of the Palestinian movement or what forms of struggle we support. Our support of Palestinian self-determination is unconditional. Our tasks are not to lecture Palestinians on how they conduct their struggle, but to lead the fight back against the British state, because it's the British state that has backed the genocide for over 2 years and the colonization of Palestine for over a century. And in this crucial period, we also need to oppose all imperialist so-called solutions for Palestine. Because as I said, while the resistance is entering into negotiations and may need to make concessions to imperialism, tactical concessions, that is their right to do so. But we need to attack our own ruling classes for forcing the resistance to make concessions in the first place. The Labour Party, the trade unions, so-called left MPs such as Jeremy Corbyn explicitly or implicitly push for this illusionary framework of a two-state solution. It is a pro-imperialist solution. That is the purpose the two-state solution serves. The Labour government itself is framing its recognition of a Palestinian state as a step towards a two-state solution. It is not self-determination for the Palestinian people that a two-state solution offers. We must be absolutely clear. Zionism is racism, and the Israeli state has absolutely no legitimacy. It is, and always has been, an attack dog for imperialism in the Middle East. And Palestinian self-determination will come when the Zionist state is destroyed. Only as a Palestinian state that stretches from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea will achieve self-determination for the Palestinian people. Anyone in Britain that says anything other than that is simply trying to provide cover for imperialism, trying to reform imperialism, as I said earlier. But we're not here to reform imperialism as communists, we're here to destroy imperialism as communists. Which means that our immediate tasks are to build a Palestine solidarity movement built on anti-imperialist principles. Not only would this movement be in opposition to the British state, but it would challenge and expose opportunism. The opportunism of the Labour movement, the opportunism of the PSC and its lackeys. It would expose the PSC, which has led the Palestine solidarity movement in Britain to stagnation. Such a movement must be democratic, politically educated, and militant. And most importantly, it must be rooted in the most oppressed sections of the working class, the most oppressed sections of the working class who have experienced imperialism and racism firsthand, who understand because of that British imperialism has no progressive role to play in the Middle East, that Zionism has no progressive role to play in the Middle East, that Zionism is and always has been a racist, imperialist, anti-working class ideology. These are the political forces that are capable of confronting the British state and building a solidarity movement worthy of calling itself in solidarity with the steadfast resistance of the people of Palestine. End British support for Zionism and victory to the Palestinian people.